Okay, Council, I just want to introduce this one as well. So we actually have our finance team here with Sarah, Emily, and Mark. We, the finance team, have been brainstorming and looking at our general fund. Well, we do it, I think, at least once a month throughout the entire year. But looking at our structural deficit, trying to be creative on how can we address that without impacting services and stretch it out as far as possible. Part of this is looking at the capital. And so I did ask the finance team, and Sarah and her team have been taking the lead on this, to look at our current capital projects and look at options for bonds. Again, it's to help preserve general funds so that we can be sustainable for our services that we're currently providing. And the second piece is, you know, we have other funds that they'll address today, REIT 1 specifically, that will also, that could be used to pay back some of the bonds, and with very minimal impact. I think there is only an impact maybe in 2025, but then you'll see in the forecast that it will continue to grow. So I just want to say I appreciate the team taking the lead on this and looking at options and being creative to bring this back to council. They will talk about all the projects that Michelle just chatted about, and then there's also a menu of options. I mean, council can certainly not do anything or pick and choose which projects or include all, but I'm just excited and happy that, you know, it was an idea that came out of the finance team, and for them to explore this has been tremendously helpful. And so with that said, I will hand it over to the team to start the presentation.
Good morning, Council, and thank you, Michelle and Kathleen. I'm Sarah Lowe. I am the Chief Deputy Treasurer in the Clark County Treasurer's Office, and I am here today with my colleagues from the finance team. So I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves really quickly.
Good morning, Council. Emily Swessig, Budget Director.
And Mark Gasway, County Finance Director.
Thanks. We are here today to present a financing proposal for council consideration for 3 of the larger capital projects that Michelle touched on in her presentation. The projects included in the proposal are the Jail Work Center, the Elections Remodel, and the District Court building. The top 3 objectives of the proposal are to, first and foremost, preserve one-time general fund cash. Secondly, to align available REIT 1 capital funding to its highest and best use. And 3, ensure the timely and efficient completion of those capital projects that I mentioned. Next slide. Before I get into the actual nuts and bolts of the proposal, I wanted to provide a brief overview of debt, the potential situational benefits, and some of the critical questions to be considered prior to issuance. First, debt is a tool that allows entities to finance one large or multiple smaller capital projects. Because all of the cash is not needed for the project up front, it allows us to maximize cash available and allows for the prioritization of other uses. There is also a generational equity component. Because the assets being financed have a long and useful life, usually 20+ years, those that use it will pay for it. And also, historically, it has been used within the county to support many critical projects, including the PSC building that we're in today. As a general reminder, debt is not a funding source. The funding source is the revenue that makes the actual payments on the debt. And in this specific instance, we're talking about REIT 1. A couple of critical questions to consider and that this presentation touches on include: what can we afford? Do we have the availability within our allowable funding sources? And thirdly, does our funding align with the project timelines? Next slide. So where does the county stand today in terms of debt management? It's really good news on most fronts. The county has a very low debt burden. Currently, we are utilizing only 1.8% of our legal capacity. So that really puts us very low in terms of that liability. That data point, although important, should not be compared to what we can actually afford, which is that critical question I mentioned earlier. Also, the county, when last rated, had a very strong credit rating of AA1. This is really the highest that we can have for an organization of our size, population-wise, and financial resources. Any issuance of debt would need to comply with county debt policy. Per state statute, the debt policy is approved by the County Finance Committee, which includes the treasurer, the county auditor, and the council chair. It was last updated in 2022, so it is very current and up to date with standards and is accredited by the statewide organization of treasurers. As required by debt policy, the council must approve all debt issuances in advance of their issue, and that's a very important component of the policy. The treasurer's office plays a distinct role in the county's debt management. We hold the contracts for the county's financial advisor, which is PFM at this time. We also hold the contract for specialized legal services, or bond counsel, which is currently Foster Garvey. And both of those organizations serve as independent advisors to the council. So we hold the contracts, but they are there for your services. If the council decides to move forward with the proposal, we would work with both the financial advisor and bonds counsel to move forward with this effort. Next slide. In terms of overall objectives for today's meeting, the goal is to get feedback from the council on the proposal and a decision on if there is agreement to move it forward in whole or in part. As I mentioned previously, the proposal has three main objectives. One, to preserve the general fund cash. Two, to align that available REIT 1 capital funding to its highest use. And three, to ensure the timely and efficient completion of the projects. There also may be an additional possibility to achieve some savings through a small refinancing, and I'll touch on that. Next slide. So this is the actual proposal here. It is structured as a menu of options for your consideration. First, it includes the jail work center at its revised total of $19.7 million. This includes the architectural and engineering costs, as well as the additional $3.5 million that Michelle mentioned that the project requires in order to be built to current design specifications. Next is the elections project at $5 million. This amount aligns with the bids that recently came in, so that amount seems pretty firm. And the third project is District Court at $14 million. This includes both the construction and the additional funding required for the completion. In whole, the financing totals $38.7 million. However, as I previously mentioned, the council can pick and choose which projects to include. In later slides, I'm going to touch on that $3.3 million for the refinancing. I am now going to pass it off to Mark so he can present to you this slide that walks through the one-time general fund that can be preserved through this financing proposal, both by project and in total.
Thank you, Sarah. I wanted to relay the thought to council that we were very intentional in selecting the projects that we did, and for several reasons. One, we wanted to be able to present council with the ability to look at specific projects, and those projects needed to relate to the financing source that we're proposing of REIT 1. So it was very intentional to select these projects because they would be eligible for that funding source. Additionally, as one of the objectives that Sarah stated, we wanted to maximize the amount of cash that we would be able to preserve from financing these projects. And as you can see on this slide, it shows that out of that $38 million financing, would be able to preserve over $32 million in cash. That cash would be available within the general fund to use for other general government purposes. We have not assign those to new projects. In fact, it would be up to council to determine through the budget process how that funding would be spent. As council is already aware, we know that the demands on the general fund are the greatest. In fact, in 2024, our budget is balanced using fund balance to help pay for certain items. This allows us to continue to look at the revenues and expenses within the general fund, examine those, and maximize the use of those funds so that we can narrow that structural gap. This allows us more time to do that. Right now, we are looking at a year or two to try and bring those two lines back into focus, the revenue and expense lines. But with this funding, we'd be able to do that without the need to do dramatic cut scenarios or other types of measures. So that being one of our objectives in preserving that cash, it's not that we've already spent it. We want to set it aside. We want to use it for this process of going through how can we better align the operating revenue expenses within the general fund. So.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Next slide, please. I'm now going to move on to the proposed structure for the bond issuance. There are some basic assumptions that it would follow. Their full compliance with debt policy is obviously first and foremost. This includes the debt service being based on a 20-year bond issuance, which is standard within our policy. Again, as Mark mentioned, REIT 1 will be the repayment source for all 3 projects included in the proposal, and those are the eligible projects. Michelle presented a whole, list of other projects that she's going to be working on, and not all of those were REIT eligible, and that's why they're not included in this proposal, as Mark alluded to. The debt service projections I am about to show you are based on current market conditions as of last week. As of this Monday, rates are actually down about 20 basis points. So there is some movement happening in the capital markets. An interest rate cut is likely, and the market does price these cuts in ahead of time, so we may actually benefit from this if the proposal moves forward. There is currently not an expectation at this time that rates will rise. I should also note for context, the interest rate environment overall is well within historical averages. I know there's a lot of discussions in the media and out there about interest rates and how high they are, and that is true, but that's really on sort of the short end of the curve in those, 2-year treasury area. We are well within the historical averages for the longer term debt. So it's not the best case scenario for issuing debt. It's not the worst. It's a pretty normal, stable environment. And lastly, just again, council can pick which options or projects to include, and the debt service would be based on which projects are chosen. And also, we will be in these projections including the recoupment of those soft project costs for architectural and engineering. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So the next 4 slides are going to detail the estimated annual debt service, again, by project first, and then we'll go to the total slide. The county's financial PFM assisted us in the development of these slides, and as you can see, there are ranges for the debt service on the bottom. For the purposes of this presentation, we are going to use the highest estimated debt service payment amounts, and that is highlighted in yellow. As I mentioned in the previous slide, rates are moving and a decline is likely, but we wanted to be conservative in our projections. So just to summarize this slide, on $19.7 million, an annual debt payment at the highest interest rate would be approximately $1.47 million annually. Next slide, please. For the elections project of $5 million, an annual debt payment at the higher interest rate would be approximately $372,000 annually. And there's not really much of a difference between those different interest rate projections on the annual debt service. And then for the district court project of $14 million, there would be an annual debt payment of approximately $1 million. This next slide provides us with the total. All totaled annual debt service on $38.7 million would be estimated at $2.9 million at that higher interest rate projection. And I should also add that these annual debt service estimates include the cost of issuance. So now I want to get to this little refinancing piece. I'm really just going to touch on this quickly. I did mention at the beginning of the presentation, the 2014 bonds were issued for the construction of the Center for Community Health. There is currently $3.3 million outstanding on those bonds, so just a small balance remains. The bonds are eligible to be refinanced. However, per our debt policy, any financing must achieve $50,000 in net present value savings. If this proposal moves forward, we would recommend including the 2014s to be refinanced. There is a cost efficiency measure, as this refi likely would not meet that eligible savings threshold if done alone, just due to the issuance cost. So if the proposal doesn't move forward, we wouldn't recommend refinancing these bonds. There's sort of just efficiencies to be gained if we do. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand it over to Emily so she can discuss the impacts to the REIT forecast based on the debt service that I mentioned.
Thank you, Sarah. So Council, this is the current REIT 1 6-year forecast. And what we wanted to represent was how the maximum projects, if you chose to finance all of the projects, how that would affect this forecast. Again, if you chose to do 1 or 2 rather than the 3, this would be less of an impact. So this forecast does show that this new debt issuance is sustainable within the forecast, and this is using the highest debt service amount. It also shows that funding will be available in future years for additional projects. At this time, this forecast doesn't show any of the new requests that might come forward as part of the annual budget process or future budget needs. But there is a commitment there that, especially after 2025, as some of the existing debt service falls off and this new debt service would come on, there will be funding available for new capital projects as we move forward. Again, this reflects the all project summary impacts of the $38.7 million. And I apologize, the rate on this slide shows 4.05%, which I think that's been adjusted to 4.04%. So I didn't get that change from the last updates we made. But it is subject to change as new information is received, and it's a point-in-time forecast. That yellow line with the little purple arrow, that is the proposed highest amount bond resolution impacts.
Thank you, Emily. We can move to the next slide. So just to summarize, sort of from a big picture perspective, the full proposal finances 3 capital projects totaling $38.7 million. This preserves $32.2 million in one-time general fund. And as illustrated by both the REIT 1 forecast that Emily went over and this slide, the additional debt service of $2.8 million annually is sustainable over the 20-year life of the REIT fund. In fact, after a short 2-year spike, which you can see on this graph in 25 and 26, the county's total debt burden will actually decline to being below where it is today. So we'll actually have a lower debt burden after that initial 2 years. Moreover, the REIT 1 funding, as Emily mentioned, will be available for additional capital projects, either through cash or through another financing. I should mention that there is some flexibility in how we do structure the debt payments. So if there is any concern at all about this spike, we may be able to do some interest-only payments in the first 2 years to smooth it out. That would result in some increased interest cost, but it should be, negligible. Next slide. So this graph just illustrates the same information really as the previous slide. It is just organized by debt issuance. And you can actually see here the debt that's falling off in 2027 and how we go back sort of down to the current rate of debt. It's actually the 2017 bonds which were used to finance this building here in the PSC. So that debt's actually falling off in 2027, which makes the REIT available for this new issuance if you so choose. So a proposed timeline for the bond issuance, we would recommend moving quickly. We would come back to council in August with a resolution delegating authority for the Treasurer's Office to execute on a bond issuance. And the process would fully conclude in late October based on this timeline here. It has been advised to us by the financial advisor that we enter the market prior to the national elections. Although we can never time the market, the early October timeframe is likely to offer a more stable rate environment. Next slide. In terms of next steps, we are hoping to receive feedback today from the council as to how you wish to move forward. If there is agreement, like I said, the next step would be to immediately engage bond counsel and PFM in the development of that resolution. And we would also have other team members, Michelle in the budget office, working in parallel to submit the necessary budget packages required for those additional amounts. And as always, if this project does move forward, we would make sure to keep the council informed all along the way and throughout the process. So I will stop there and take any questions or comments.
So, council, I think this is a very important discussion we're about to have. So I'm going to ask for questions and comments as you go so we can fully get your response to this. I know we were each in one-on-ones previous to this, but none of us were privy to the other's thought processes or questions. So, Karen, do you have your mic on, or did you wish to begin?
Yes, it is. Yes, I appreciated the time in one-on-ones and actually had any questions answered at that time. I'm very, very supportive of this approach and think it's just so timely the way the work that Michelle is doing and the financing of it is coordinated, and thank you for that. I don't have questions.
Other counselors?
I would just echo what Councilor Bowerman said. I asked all my questions during the one-on-one as well. I don't really have any questions either. I got all my questions answered by the finance team when I met with them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, I'm sorry, Sue or Glenn?
Yes, thank you. Could you, I really appreciate this work, and I think it wouldn't have been something I would have thought of, so I'm glad that you all put this together. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of preserving that general fund? We haven't seen what the budget numbers are going to look like next year, but anticipate that it's going to be a tough budget year for us. So if you could just generally talk about the importance of that aspect.
Sure, I will start, and I think Mark could definitely add to that. There is, as the council has been apprised, there is a structural deficit within the general fund, and right now, the conversations we have not reflected any of the new budget requests that will be coming forward through the 2025 budget process in future years. So it is extremely important in that, as Mark mentioned earlier, we're using one-time fund balance to continue to pay for ongoing operational costs, and that is not sustainable. So this particular option that the council has been presented with would bring one-time fund balance back to the general fund to smooth out multiple years into the future for problem solving and decision making to address that structural balance.
And I'd just like to add, just because we are currently in 2024 in a structural deficit doesn't mean we've stopped. Every week, we're talking about this all the time. How do we maximize our revenues in the general fund, and how do we contain expenses? It's a constant discussion that we're having as a finance team advising the county manager. So it's not like we're sitting back saying, oh, thank goodness we can take a break from doing this. This will just give us a little bit more time, as Emily mentioned, maybe a year or two to bring the divergent lines back into alignment. And so having that fund balance available, again, that is the purpose of fund balance, to help us work through these problems and not have to make drastic changes immediately. So there's no one on the finance team that has said, well, here's what we're going to spend that on. We need it, or we would like to have it available so that we can make better, thoughtful decisions and propose those through the budget process to council.
And I would like to add on to that what Mark was just discussing. You know, this is a one-time buffer to get us through, but starting in January, when we do our retreat, we usually go over policy priorities, but we're going to be intentional this next January, and I don't know if it's going to be monthly or a couple times a month, where we're going to have dedicated discussions with council to talk about policy priorities, because we don't have the ongoing budget to support all of what we're doing now. So we need to hear from council what is most important to you. Is it parks? Is it, you know, what types of services? So that will be an intentional discussion with council starting in January, hoping that we can implement the outcome of that during the 2026 budget process, which starts mid-year in 2024. So this, and Amber has said this before, and we've talked about this in our finance team, structural deficit, we all know what it means because we talk about it all the time, but it is, if you think about your bank account, you're using your savings and overspending your checking account and keep going, and eventually that runs out and you then have zero money. So we don't want to be in that situation, but that's where we're at right now, and it's not, you know, not best practice or sustainable to keep using one time to get us balanced.
Thank you very much for that explanation. I think it's important for the public to understand the broader context for which we're making this particular decision. So I appreciate that.
Glenn, I'm sorry, I heard somebody speak.
What was that? Yeah, this
I
is
was
Councilor
asking
Young.
Glenn if you had questions or comments.
Yes, don't really have any questions. I think that this is the best path forward for multiple reasons. I very much agree with debt in this situation. It makes sense. It's the generational part of that, the concept of that is very true. So that everybody's paying it for the whole time rather than us now footing the bill for it. You know, the other thing too is, I mean, you look at the increase in cost just to the work center, just from a change in energy code, and you're already paying for all the interest that you paid on it right there over time. So, I mean, not all, but a good chunk of it. The point is that inflation is very much outpacing whatever interest rate we would have to pay on those funds. So makes sense. My concern is what I'd mentioned in our one-on-ones is that and I appreciate that we're going to be hitting this in January, because this is a short-term fix, and we can't delay the urgency on this. We've got to figure this out, and, you know, we keep talking about how we can get those lines back together, but I haven't heard that yet. I haven't heard anything yet on how we're going to be able to do that. So I think it's critical to, you know, and if we're going to have to make some big changes, we start making those very soon, you know, or we talk about a way to generate more revenue, one of the two. I think that, you know, there's always a little bit of belt tightening that we can do, but you can only tighten it so far, you know, and I think we're at a point now where we basically, because of the structural deficit for a long period of time, we've been kind of tightening that belt a little bit every year because our expenses have outpaced our revenue. So, I mean, it's just, we have really big and important conversations to have around this. I thank you for your work on this. I think this is a good solution to multiple issues that we're dealing with, and very supportive of moving forward at this point.
All right, so I don't want anything I'm going to say to be misconstrued, but I also apologize to the finance team for repeating some of what we discussed on the one-on-one, because I think it's important for the public to hear it. So first, kind of a confession. This is far more conservative, sophisticated thinking than I'm used to. And I think we are, to some extent, upping our game as far as managing our debt and the needs for our capital improvements. But the confession part of it is, this is more sophisticated than I'm used to, and I'm so much more conservative. Just as some examples, I don't carry any credit card debt. I never have, never. When I had student loans, as soon as I got a job, I paid them off. I ate spaghetti for like years with no kids and no spouse until I paid off that debt. I'm just someone who doesn't like debt. I was raised that way. And so that's the frustrating part I have with all of this. And getting to my questions eventually. We have $1 billion in the bank across the county, for which we're earning a lot of interest. About half of that, about 500 million, is our county portion of what's invested. To translate that in a simplistic way, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's kind of a rainy day fund, a strategic fund. But that's money our taxpayers would otherwise have in their own bank account, investing themselves. And we're not in the finance business to be making money. We're not in a growth industry. We're not a business to grow and have some of these sophisticated money management schemes in place. And just on a small example, and I think we're making great progress in alleviating this, but our mental health sales tax fund is a good example. We have $17 million sitting in the bank there to spend this year. This year, because we're drawing over $1 million in tax every month. So we had been taking money from our taxpayers and having it sit in the bank unused. That's really unconscionable to me. So you talk about tightening belts. I don't even think we're there yet. So that's my caution. The questions I had for the team involved our ARPA funds. ARPA money wasn't free money, in the sense that all of our taxpayers nationally are now paying for it in huge ways because of the inflation that it drove. Now, it would have been imprudent for us not to take that money. We probably would have been among the very few counties in the country that would have refused the money. It was available, we needed it, and that money was without the cost of money as far as to the county. Again, it caused inflation in large part, and most people are struggling from groceries to fuel, among other things, because of that ARPA money. But we have all that ARPA money set aside. When we first got it, we tried to use it in the very best way we had, but we don't have any debt payment on it. If we convert that into our general fund, we are now going to be converting to absorbing debt payment on the money that we borrow, which certainly makes our general fund a lot more healthy and makes spending a lot more free for the executive branch. But it's all at a cost to our taxpayers, ultimately. And that's the part I'm struggling with. We also had moving targets on what the business rules were. Originally, when we had the bulk sum coming to us, to the county, and then sequestered it for different purposes, capital and operational maintenance and different issues, we were originally told we could take 10 million and put it right into our general fund. Now, evidently, there's formulas, and they may have changed over time, but now we're told 18 million for this year alone, for 2024. So I'm still trying to struggle with what has changed with those business rules. How are we converting all of this ARPA money into our general fund and freeing it up? And that doesn't violate the ARPA business rules. Obviously, I don't want to take any chance that we're going to not survive an audit by moving around this money that we shouldn't be moving around. So having said all that, as far as a frustration level for me, I think I really appreciate these ideas. I think they are very sophisticated. And just the bottom line, we're using 1.8% of our available debt. That's ridiculously low. It shows a complete lack of sophistication over the years in having a healthy debt ratio. We certainly want to preserve our rating, but that shouldn't be the driving force for sure. But I know it's part of the process. So anyway, I'm not as enthusiastic as the rest of you, just because we have so much money of our taxpayer collected property and sales tax funds already in the bank, already just sitting there, already earning interest for us, for the county. So we're kind of competing with our taxpayers, and I don't like that. Any comments, Mark, on anything I've said, especially on the ARPA business rule changes or adjustments?
Just a couple comments. One, I just want to remind council about the restricted nature of funds and how they have to be used. So when you're talking about mental health sales tax, or you're talking about REIT 1, there are specific purposes that you can use these funds for. REIT 1 is intended, and it's collected based on real estate transactions to support the infrastructure needs of the county. That's why the finance team has recommended we use REIT 1, because we are financing infrastructure projects. It can't be used for general purpose government. The question with mental health sales tax is the same way. You have to have very specific projects that you can use that for. It cannot be used for general government. With ARPA, one of the main focuses of the ARPA grant was to allow governments to support general government services through what's called revenue recovery. And this county has followed all of the revenue recovery guidelines and formulas that the Department of Treasury has given us. In fact, the first 2 years of our revenue recovery have already been audited, and they've passed audit. So we are following the rules and following the intent of the ARPA grant to help support general government services. The way our council has determined we wanted to, as a council wanted to use those ARPA funds, has been completely up to the council. The revenue recovery process is just a mechanism that we use. We continue to follow council's guidance on what that revenue is being used for as the project's approved by the council. So I'm not sure, where the confusion is. When we talk about revenue streams, You have to first identify how that revenue can be
Mark,
used.
I don't know, I'm not confused
Yeah.
about any of that, so I'm not sure why you're characterizing that way.
I thought that's what you were asking me, Chair.
No, I was asking specifically about the conversion money. We were originally told year one, 10 million went to the general fund. And then over the years, we're now converting much more into the
So let me
general
speak
fund.
to that
was the
specifically.
specific
Yeah.
question. It's
Let
not
me
confusion.
speak to that
It's
specifically.
basically, we've been told different things over the years.
So there is an allowance within Department of Treasury rules for those entities that received 10 million or less. They could just recognize a one-time revenue recovery. Okay, so that was a specific guidelines for small jurisdictions. We received 95 million, so that did not apply to us. We have to follow the revenue recovery formula that the Department of Treasury has set out. That formula, depending on your revenue and expenses within your organization, determine the amount of revenue recovery. So for example, the first year that we calculated the formula, it was 2.3 million. The second year, it changes based on the formula. It changed to 12.5 million, I believe, and then this year it's 18 million. So it changes based on the formula that the Department of Treasury has had. And for us, we have to follow each year and recompute the amount that is eligible for revenue recovery, which we do.
Other comments or questions by council?
Chair?
Yes, please.
Just a couple quick comments. So and I appreciate the thought process that you have, and I consider myself fiscally conservative as well. Couple things that I would say is I wouldn't compare this to credit card debt. This would be more like a mortgage. Something that it's a long-term thing. It's something that is needed. It's not just a want. And that you're going to have income over time, or at least you hope you're going to have income over time to pay for that larger asset that you need today. And then as far as like the fund balances, I view things considerably different. The way my budget works is I have my mortgage payment come out each month, and I need to make sure that I have at least that amount in my checking account to cover it. But if I only got paid once every 6 months, if I only got paid once every 6 months, if I only have 1 month's worth of mortgage payment in my account, I've got a problem. And so that's kind of what's happening here. There's a lot of funds that are tied up for future expenses that are sitting in accounts. Yes, they're earning interest, which is a good thing, but it's money that's tied up that is going to be, it's already allocated for something. We don't really have any large fund balances that aren't dedicated to something. Mental health sales tax right now, I think, is an anomaly, and we all know that that's going away very soon, that large balance that's in there. So I appreciate the notion and your comments and the thought process behind it, but I view this a little bit differently.
Yeah, so I just do want to add to that comment because we see it at the Washington state level in Olympia. The more money you have, the more you spend.
Do we need a motion or just a kind of thumbs up or?
Yes, we would
I think
need
we're at a thumbs
some
up.
sort of thumbs up. Yeah, and that will provide the direction to staff to move forward with the official process that will be coming back to you for final approval.
So just we didn't really discuss anything with Fidelity as far as if you're considering a thumbs up to all of it or picking and choosing among different conversions. Any thoughts on that, or you just want to give a thumbs up or down on the whole enchilada?
I would be supportive of the entire package.
I as well.
And me as well.
I do as well.
Okay, so I'm the only nay vote at this point, so the staff has the direction.
Thank you. We will see you back in August with the resolution.
So Kathleen, that was the last for the morning, was it not?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so we'll adjourn this. We'll restart at 1. I'll be present in person downtown at that meeting. Have a good rest of your morning, everyone.